This story begins in the middle of a traffic jam. Meanwhile, a boy was walking, messing with his phone. A person says that the family will gather because of a birthday, so he should get home early. But the guy says he already had plans with his friends, and the other person asks him to bring a gift. Thus, time keeps passing by. The person from the message asks when he will arrive because everyone was already at the cafe, but the boy replies that he won't be able to make it, mentioning he will see them the next day. While walking, the boy bumps into someone, who then calls him an idiot, and the protagonist apologizes for the incident. Next, the young man wonders what Juno might like as a birthday present. At the same moment, a loud noise begins to envelop the area. The people around are confused by everything. Then, lightning strikes across the sky and an explosion happens. As a result, several traffic accidents begin to occur. Another lightning bolt strikes the building next to them. As a consequence, another explosion happens. Desperate people begin to flee, while several lightning bolts head towards that place, starting to hit the entire city. Meanwhile, the protagonist, along with everyone else, is also fleeing. Looking to the side, he notices a girl asking for help. So, he calls her to come toward him. But at the same moment, that girl is hit by an ambulance. The protagonist, with tears streaming down his face, wonders what is happening and whether this is all just a dream. Next, the boy finds himself in front of a truck. But before getting hit, something strange happens. Time passes, and at night, a bolt of lightning seems to strike a certain spot. At that very moment, the protagonist wakes up, surprised to still be alive, wondering where he is, because he was sure he got hit by a truck. Looking up, he becomes confused, as there are several monsters surrounding the area. Confused, he asks himself what is going on, and moreover, why he has no clothes on. Shortly after, the young man stands up, seeming surprised by something, as he finds himself face to face with a giant bear. However, within seconds, he is attacked by a pack of wolves. Then the scene cuts to a doctor analyzing some data, saying that when he woke up, he was on a planet with 2 moons and a forest full of monsters, wondering how he managed to come back alive from such a place. However, the young man seemed to be apprehensive about something. A flashback of that bear being defeated appears. Then, the wolves begin to devour the bear. The protagonist, watching it all, is desperate. Meanwhile, a white wolf is behind him. The boy suddenly notices the creature behind him. As a result, he starts running non-stop. To survive, he gave it everything he had. At that moment, a system informs him that his constitution has increased to level 1. Seeing all of this, the protagonist is confused, but he trips over a rock, starting to tumble downhill, falling off a cliff. However, the boy manages to grab onto some bushes, successfully staying alive, wondering what that sound from earlier had been. Looking around, he is surprised as he finds a kind of fruit in front of him, mentioning that he is very hungry and wondering if they are edible. But when he looks to the side, he notices some ants eating those fruits. So, without any remorse, he starts eating them. But at the same moment, he hears a noise in the bushes, and a creature with a piercing gaze is watching him. Then, a giant snake lunges at the boy, but within seconds, it is devoured by a giant frog. The young man watching all of this still cannot believe what he is seeing. That place is completely insane. But in reality, maybe he is the one who has gone mad. Time passes, and it's now been 67 days since he arrived in that place. Moreover, that pack of wolves from earlier has been following him and still hasn't given up. That's why the boy fears they might catch him off guard at any moment. Additionally, the forest has things far more dangerous than wolves, so he needs to find a safe place. Once again, time passes, and it's now been a year since he has been in that place. Looking up, the protagonist finds a giant banana. So, he begins grabbing the big banana. The system alerts him that his strength has increased to level 1, and you can already see that the boy is quite ripped. As a consequence of everything happening around him, the protagonist has been forced to adapt. However, the wolf pup keeps insisting on chasing him at all costs. That's why he got so used to it that he even missed it when it wasn't around. Meanwhile, something seemed to be falling on the boy's back. Looking up, he notices something. His expression quickly changes, because he had encountered a giant gorilla charging directly at him. However, the young man manages to dodge the attack, breaking the branch he was holding on to, saying he should have better luck next time. As a result, the gorilla falls to the ground, but it was heading towards that wolf and ends up hitting it. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching everything. Soon after, the gorilla gets back up, looking at the wolf that was apparently injured, beginning to charge at it. However, the protagonist was already advancing towards the gorilla, landing an attack on its eye. But that still wasn't enough. So, the gorilla throws the boy. He collides with a tree. Quickly, the monster charges at him again. Irritated, the young man says that was a very stupid move on his part. The scene then cuts to the doctor asking if the protagonist had really done all of that. The boy replies that he couldn't keep running away from territorial fights, and that wouldn't solve anything because no matter where he went, there would always be a ruler. Returning to the scene, the protagonist was about to be attacked by the gorilla. However, the wolf ends up appearing to protect the young man. The boy becomes unconscious while the pack attacks the gorilla. He truly thought it was his end, but the wolves didn't attack him while he was unconscious because they must have thought he saved the cub earlier. And that little one was the son of the Wolf King. Leader of the Crimson Wolves. Time passes after that event, and those wolves were running towards that location. Alongside them, the protagonist, together with the wolves, was also running. Looking to the side, he notices that his friend was tired, so he picks him up and starts carrying him. Once again, time passes, and it's been 2 years since the boy had been there. That's why it seemed like they had accepted him into the pack. 3 years had passed since the young man was stranded, and he seemed to be developing his climbing skills. However, he was still in the forest, and in fact, he still hadn't managed to escape that place. Moreover, he hadn't found any civilization. Thus, he had become a member of the wolf family and continued participating in territorial battles for the survival of his family. Once again, time passes, and it's been 120 years since he was stranded. That's why he thought he was the only human on that planet. In a constant battle for survival, he ended up making more friends, but even so, he lost some companions, wondering how long he had been stranded because he had forgotten the date, and it seemed like 100 of years had passed, wondering how he was still alive. The doctor then asks, after becoming the king of the wolves, even after 500 years, he still hadn't found any civilization. That's why he wanted to know how he had managed to return to planet Earth. The boy replies that he had started a war against the gorilla race for the Lunar Hill. Thus, a giant battle broke out, and the protagonist was also in the middle of it, charging at one of the gorillas. However, something strange happens as he was teleported once again, and when he opens his eyes, he is in a different place. Meanwhile, a girl seems to be analyzing a radio, mentioning that something was very strange as the dimensional energy was off the charts. The other guy then asks her to send the coordinates to the portal control team. So, the girl does as he requested. At that moment, a portal begins to open. Thus, everyone starts fleeing the area, and an explosion occurs, and that collision causes everyone to fall to the ground, surprised because a portal had really opened. The other guy, desperate, says he doesn't want to die, and the other girl is already prepared for an attack, saying she will buy time so they should flee. The other guy then asks headquarters to send emergency reinforcements to that location. At that moment, the portal was in front of the girl. She then tells the person to get out of there, as she was going to cut them to pieces. At that moment, a man's silhouette appears from the portal, leaving the girl completely shocked by what she saw, and as a result, she becomes paralyzed. At that moment, the man begins to scream. Then he comes out of the portal. At that moment, the girl approaches the protagonist, and the other guy is surprised because it really was another person. The girl wonders what that force from earlier was all about, because it was a pressure she had never felt before, not even against monsters in high-level dungeons. She wondered what the protagonist was. Thus, the situation was resolved and that boy was a returnee, so they should call the ambulance right away. Then the scene cuts again to the professor. He thanks the boy for everything. His testimony and medical examination would be shared with the awakened central office. For that reason, he seemed quite healthy and should be discharged in a few days. Shortly after, the boy calls the doctor again, saying it was the first time he had spoken to a civilized being in 1,000 years. So he thanks him for listening to his story. The doctor informs him that he had shared a very valuable story. Thus, they should be the ones thanking him. Then, he leaves the room. While walking, he thinks that the boy was a very interesting patient, and his story was vividly detailed, which would have made him a great novelist. Then, the scene cuts to the awakened central office, and that girl asks if they were sure the information was correct, because it didn't seem right. The guy then questions what was wrong with it. The girl responds that the card said he was an F rank. The man explains that he was a rare F rank patient, and it was a shame because if he had been E rank, he would have received a government disability benefit. The girl looking at the protagonist's card says that if he was an F rank, it meant he was an ordinary person, wondering how he managed to pass through a portal and if they were sure it wasn't a mistake. The guy responds that he was lucky and slipped through, and by chance, he found the returned stone, mentioning that he had just received the doctor's report, asking if she wanted to read it. So the girl starts reading that information, as it was a common disorder among F-rank returnees. Moreover, he was behaving as if he were a wolf. Remembering the protagonist's expression, the girl wonders if it had been her imagination, asking if that was the documentation for the returnee named Park. The man confirms that it was, saying that even though he was an F rank, they still needed to treat a returnee accordingly, so the girl asks to deliver it to him personally. However, the man wants to know why. She responds that she needed to check with her own eyes. 2 weeks had passed since he returned to Earth after spending a 1,000 years in another world. He wanted to go back at any moment, but since he had returned, everything seemed very strange. For that reason, he didn't know how he should live from that day forward. Shortly after, a girl appears, mentioning that it's time for his meal. She then hands him his food, and the boy apparently was hungry, so he should eat right away. Shortly after, that other girl appears, observing the protagonist eating in a different way. Then Park notices that the girl is beside him. It is revealed that her name is Choi, and she is from the awakened central office. Standing up, Park says that the scent was of a blonde person. For that reason, it seemed very familiar. Koda responds that she was the first person he had met when he returned, thinking that he definitely resembled a predator when he came out of the portal. However, perhaps there was something wrong with his sensory ability. Finishing his meal, Park says it was very tasty, asking what the awakened central office was about. Then the girl asks why he was speaking so informally with her. Park replies that he was over 1,000 years old, and the girl didn't seem to believe him, saying that the awakened central office was an organization designed to help returnees adjust to society. Therefore, those were the pieces of information that returnees needed to know. He could take as much time as he needed to read them. For now, he should just sigh and agree to share his information. Shortly after, Park takes the pen, saying it had been a long time since he had seen that object. Even so, after 1,000 years since he returned, they were still using that kind of tool. Shortly after, Park signs the paper. Observing the protagonist, Choi wonders if he was nothing more than an idiot. Right after, she calls the boy again. He then asks what she wanted. Choi asks if he had learned how to draw in that place. The protagonist replies that he already knew how to draw before. Choi asks if he had learned anything different, like magic or martial arts. Park replies no, as he had lived in a forest. To survive, he had to do many things. The girl then comments that, in order to survive, he spent 10 years running everywhere, and that to become a true returnee capable of crossing portals, it's necessary to kill monsters and steal their dimensional energy. However, she mentions that despite surviving in such a dangerous dimension, he only managed to cross the portal and find the return stone by pure luck. Park responds that he wasn't there for 10 years, but for 1,000 years. Choi, irritated, says it wasn't 1,000 years, but only 10, and that he was mistaken. Choi asks him to check his information, which indicates that he disappeared in 2015 and returned in 2025 through a portal. Looking at the data, the boy is surprised, realizing it was true. The girl then hands him his awakened identification again. As she walks away, Choi mentions that part of his expenses would be deducted due to the damage he caused, and that he should inquire about it. She also recommends that once he's recovered, he should go straight back to his family. Shortly after, Choi says goodbye and leaves. Park, for his part, is thoughtful about the girl's words. He wonders if his family would still be alive. In the past, he had given up on everything, assuming that even if he returned to Earth, his friends and family would already be dead. Now that he had returned, he had to deal with the fact that he had lost the forest family that had been with him for 1,000 years. However, that was only an assumption, as only 10 years had passed. Upon examining the documents, Park is shocked. He discovers that his parents had indeed died on that day. However, not everything was lost, as Juno, his younger brother, was still alive. Desperate, Park quickly tries to leave the hospital and rushes back to the doctor. The doctor asks if there is a problem, and Park replies that he needs his help because his brother is still alive, and he wants to know if the doctor could find him. The doctor, hesitant, says he doesn't believe Park is ready to return to society, and that he would need to check the situation first. Park, impatient, responds that the doctor hadn't understood the seriousness of the situation, as he wasn't there to ask for permission. At that moment, the doctor makes a gesture indicating something. He then mentions that there was a condition. Shortly after, the boy is already in a car, thanking the doctor and promising not to forget the favor. The doctor responds that they will stay in touch. Before leaving, he asks the driver to ensure Park arrives safely, as he still wasn't fully recovered. As the car drives away, the girl comments that the doctor paid all of Park's hospital expenses, as well as providing clothes and even the driver. She asks why he did all of that for Park. Considering that returnees of rank X are usually neglected by the central office, the doctor replies that he wanted to keep hearing that man's story, and besides, he needed to fix the doorknob as soon as possible. The girl, surprised, remembers how the doorknob was damaged, recalling the moment when Park opened the door in a hurry. Later, the doctor is in his office, reflecting that it was the second time the doorknob had been broken. He comments that it had been a long time since he had smelled an irregular. Meanwhile, Park is still in the taxi. A news report comes on, informing that at 3:00 p.m. that day, monsters had escaped in an unprotected field in the province. The error occurred due to a miscalculation in the breaking of a portal. The monsters were surrounding the area. The situation was expected to be resolved in approximately 50 minutes. 2 attacks were neutralized, but 12 awakened soldiers had died. As he listens to the news, Park watches closely. A flashback of the doctor appears, where he mentions that the world had changed drastically, becoming a completely different place after the Great Disaster. The doctor comments that if he were awakened, he would have quit his mediocre job and become rich by hunting in the fields. The protagonist then asks what that was. The man responds that Park must have hit his head hard not to even know that. Park in turn asks him to just explain it already. 10 years ago, a door opened to the entire world. That's why that day is called the Great Disaster. It was the first dimensional convergence of their world, which connected with several others and was invaded by monsters. On that day, 10% of the world's population was lost. The military at the time wasn't enough to stop the monsters that appeared everywhere. So, in regions where military strength was weak, mercenaries were sent. People who disappeared during the disaster, or the so-called awakened, received mercenary licenses and permission to hunt monsters. Park then asks how he could become a mercenary. The man bursts out laughing, saying it's difficult for an ordinary person, because first, you need to awaken. After that, you just need to pass the mercenary test at the Awakened Central Office. The boy comments that it sounded pretty complicated. Time passes, and the boy seems to be heading somewhere. The driver informs him that they have arrived. He asks if Park can see the house in front, as that was the indicated address. Shortly after, the protagonist steps out of the car, thanking him for everything. Meanwhile, the young man walks toward the house. An elderly woman observes him from above and asks who he is. He responds that he is there for Chono. The woman stays silent and comments that he still wears diapers, but talks as if he were an adult. Park, however, doesn't understand what she means. She responds that no one by that name lives there and asks him to leave. The boy wonders if he had come to the wrong place. However, inside the house, he hears some people arguing. Shortly after, he approaches the door. He picks up a piece of paper nearby, wondering if his brother was in debt. Sometime later, the boy is walking down the street, thinking that in the jungle, the law of the strongest prevails. But in civilized society, money is the true power. The scene then cuts to a building. Park enters and presents his awakened card. The woman informs him that his application for the mercenary test was denied because he didn't meet the requirements. Park asks what was wrong since he's an FM rank awakened. The woman replies that he was classified as F rank, 4 points below the necessary level. The boy asks how that's possible, as he had crossed a portal 2 weeks ago. The woman explains that ordinary people die when they try to cross a portal. Their bodies split in half. She continues, saying she doesn't believe he really did it. Either way, he could attend the awakened school or earn points in field battles, and should return when he becomes a true awakened. Leaving the place, Park thinks that the system is very confusing. However, he becomes curious about the Goblin Field in Suwon. The scene cuts to another location. Inside a taxi, Park asks how far those walls stretch. The driver replies that they surround the entire city, and then he can see it on the map app. He asks if Park has a download of the app, as the city is divided into 12 areas, with hundreds of gates for transit between them. Park, observing the situation, decides he needs to buy a phone immediately. Shortly after, He spots his destination, and the taxi informs him they've arrived at Siwon Field, Gate Twaton. The boy gets out of the car and faces a giant area. He assumes that crossing that gate would lead to a hunting ground. Shortly after, he begins walking toward the location. Two soldiers stand motionless at the site. They ask what the protagonist is doing there. He replies that he's there to hunt. One of the soldiers remains silent and asks to see his mercenary license. However, Park responds that he doesn't have one. The soldier says that ordinary civilians are prohibited from entering that area. They then notice something nearby. The other soldier requests they close the exit, but it's too late. A car appears crashing through the site. Inside the car, a creature devours a man. As a result, the car collides with a wall. Meanwhile, the other soldier calls for the emergency squad to contain the creature. The soldiers surround the vehicle and assume combat positions. The creature exits the car. The soldiers give the order to fire and begin shooting at the monster multiple times. The creature appears to be defeated. The soldiers report that the situation has been resolved and that a monster that crossed the gate has been killed. The other soldier wonders where Park went. He wonders if Park had left the area. He probably ran away after seeing the monster. However, that wasn't the case. Meanwhile, the protagonist walks outside the area, mentioning that it was a field. But even so, he could feel everything. Moreover, he would have to buy a car for himself. The boy looks around, wondering if except for the city of Seo, all the other cities were completely destroyed. For that reason, he couldn't believe it. Sometime later, night has fallen. Park mentions that the darkness felt very familiar. He starts walking among the ruins, saying it's time to hunt. Shortly after, he falls to the ground, assuming that his body felt a bit heavy. Meanwhile, he observes some buildings. Then, he begins to run quickly toward them. He successfully climbs them. Reaching the top shortly after, someone punches him in the face, mentioning that it had been a long time and that they were worried, because he had said he would abandon his child and run away. The man looks and seems to recognize that person. Then the others start beating Junho, saying that he seemed better than the last time they saw him, asking how many times he thought they had come there. Shortly after, Juno takes out some money and mentions that this was the payment he had received. Counting the bills, the man says that the monthly fee was 8,000 Brazilian real, and the accumulated interest was more than 6,000 Brazilian real. So, there was still money missing. With tears in his eyes, Cherno apologizes, saying that if he couldn't get the money, they should wait 3 days. Hitting him again, the man asks how much he thought 3 days of interest were, telling him to stop lying. At that moment, someone calls out for Juno. The other man asks who that person was. Juno is shocked to realize that his brother is still alive. Shortly after, Park approaches his brother and asks if he is Juno. Then, a flashback shows Juno being bullied by other people. Immediately after, the protagonist is seen watching the situation. Juno begs his brother for help. However, Park seemed to completely ignore it, leaving Juno alone in that situation and walking away. Thus, his brother was never much help in his life. Then, the flashback shows news of unknown explosions spreading across the country. Additionally, red spheres, which were portals, began appearing along with the explosions. Juno, watching all of this, is shocked. He runs toward his mother's room. His parents are happy because he was home. However, they still didn't know the whereabouts of the other brother. At that moment, an explosion occurs, and several monsters begin to appear. Meanwhile, a giant eye is watching Juno. Shortly after, he disappears. Returning to the present, Park seems pleased, mentioning that Juno had grown since the last time he saw him. Juno responds that he thought Park was dead. Immediately after, the other guy interrupts the situation. He asks if that man was really Juno's older brother. At that moment, Park grabs the boy's head. In seconds, the boy is thrown back. Junho watches in shock. The protagonist threw the guy so hard that he flew to the side. The two henchmen are stunned by what they just saw. Park asks if his brother is hurt. He replies that he's fine. At that moment, the other guy charges at Park. Park attempts to kick him. However, it seemed to have no effect. The man's leg simply broke. Falling to the ground, the guy begins writhing in pain. The other guy is still trembling in fear. It assumes that the protagonist is an awakened being. Shortly after, Park tells the man to come in him. However, the man responds that he hadn't hurt him. He says Park had to believe him. He told those people to leave him alone. Shortly after, Park hands some money to the man. He tells him to take the money and leave. Sometime later, night has fallen. That elderly woman appears. In front of her, the protagonist, along with his brother, watches. The woman asks if he was sure that man was his brother. Shuno responds that he's sure. Park, calling the woman grandma, mentions that he brought some meat. The woman says there should be contact as it's family. She asks them to hurry up because the boy had fallen asleep waiting for his father to come home. Inside the house, a boy seems to be sleeping. Park asks Juno if that was his son. Juno responds that his name is Gung Ho and that he's his only treasure. Park asks where the boy's mother was. Juno replies that she had left to live her own life, but it was his fault for not providing enough for his family. Park, trying to change his mood, says they should have a drink. Later, they are at the table drinking. Juno responds that after Park disappeared, he thought he was dead all this time, but he was alive without even having aged. Park asks how much money he owed. Juno responds that it was around 220 Brazilian real. But it's okay, because he's sure he'll manage to handle his debts. He says he has a job now. The protagonist asks what kind of job he has. Juno responds that he works at a logistics center. Park asks if the truck was his. Juno replies that it wasn't, and that it used to belong to his grandmother's son. However, he had rented it from her. Once again, the protagonist asks what his grandmother's son used to do. Then, Juno responds that he had heard that Park had died during the Great Disaster. Shortly after, the boy wakes up, realizing there was a dog in front of him. Looking to the side, he finds his father. Juno, happy, asks if his son had already woken up. Embarrassed, the boy asks who that man was. His father replies that it was his uncle, asking him to greet him. A while later, the boy is seen playing with the dog. Juno thinks it's good to see that. The boy had always wanted a dog. Park suggests that the two of them should work together. However, Juno seems confused by this. Park responds that he will do all the work. He just asks for help with the truck. Juno, on the other hand, asks what he was planning to do. Park replies that he wants to hunt some monsters. This leaves Juno completely surprised by what he just heard. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the command center. That girl is congratulating the protagonist. The protagonist registers as an awakened being. Somehow, he had managed to increase his stats in just one day. Park asks if he's now in FIES ranked Druid. The girl responds that now he could use his identification to open a bank account. She says he could carry out financial transactions. Handing something to him, she mentions that it was a small gift. It was for registering as an awakened being. Also, he shouldn't forget to download the Awakened Central app. She tells him to gather enough dimensional energy to become a ranker. He should be eligible for pensions and many other benefits. She asks if the protagonist knew how to open a status window. Due to recent technical issues, the interface had undergone changes. At that moment, Park says the keyword. The system screen appears, showing all his stats. Observing this, Park wonders why his stats were so low. Then the scene cuts to the truck belonging to Park's brother. He is happy because his brother managed to get phone. He congratulates him on officially becoming an awakened being. In the middle of the call, he says he's on his way, so he'll meet his brother there as soon as he delivers the last batch. Now that Park has become an awakened being on paper, all that remains is the mercenary test. However, Park replies that before they do that, they should pay off his debt. Juno responds that he's still an F rank, so he doesn't think they're ready to hunt monsters yet. However, the protagonist hangs up on him. Juno wonders if this was really his brother. It seemed like he had completely changed. As he walks toward the location, the protagonist says, "The gate seems to be closed." Meanwhile, on Route 77, a group of people seems to be in a rush because they're going to miss their game. Inside the car, a group of people seems nervous. However, the other guy tells them to relax. He asks why they're scared since they're awakened after all. He questions if they had forgotten they could officially become raiders in the guild, because if they succeeded, they'd be able to clear that dungeon. Annoyed, the other guy thinks that these people are very incompetent. They were doing it for the money, and wouldn't have come this far without their connections. Shortly after, the soldier calls for the next person. Thus, the man is surprised, and the protagonist appears again in that place. The soldier asks if he's alone. Park responds that he is. Shortly after, Park places his card on the reader. The soldier begins pulling up some data on the protagonist. He asks if Park knew that was a ranking with limits, so he couldn't enter just any dungeon. Meanwhile, the man from before is observing the protagonist, who is entering that place completely alone. The other soldier asks if he thought the protagonist would be okay. After all, he didn't even have the proper equipment. However, the other guy tells him not to worry, because that was the guy who single-handedly dealt with 7 goblins at Gate 27. The other guy in the car, apparently jealous of the protagonist, wonders who he thought he was, wondering if he was going into the field like that. For that reason, he thought Park was crazy. The other soldier then apologizes for the delay, saying he was having some technical issues. Finishing the verification, the guy tells his friend to speed up because they're going to follow the protagonist's route. However, he becomes confused because the boy had simply disappeared in the middle of that tunnel. The other guy wonders where Park had gone, and the man thinks he might have encountered something very interesting. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to the forest, and Park seems to be running through the place. Shortly after, he stops saying that this must be the current state of his body, so it seemed like Park had become very weak. He needed to motivate himself to improve and start training again. Looking at something, he seemed surprised. He was hearing strange voices, and he guessed it could be the sound of a sword battle. A little further ahead, the boy noticed something, and he assumed that the sound was coming from that direction. Shortly after, the young man smiled, thinking that a fight between civilized beings rather than beasts could be a very good opportunity. For that reason, he couldn't afford to miss it. The scene then cuts to someone losing their arm. Above that battle, the protagonist coldly observes, and in the midst of the commotion, a group of people is being surrounded. Park, irritated, says that it seemed like it would take all day for them to start killing. Meanwhile, a man steps out of a car. He asks why it's taking so long to deal with those people. The soldier, observing the man, seems surprised. Then, irritated, the man tells them to deal with it at once. Another man says that person had a bounty of 200,000 Brazilian real on his head. Meanwhile, the protagonist is observing what the man is saying, surprised by the amount he could receive if he killed that person. The soldier watching that man seemed astonished. Thus, the group seemed ready to finish off those people. The man then affirms that his bounty is that amount, so they should try to catch him if they could. However, the group of people didn't seem very confident, wondering if, even giving their all, they would be able to win. At that moment, the man charges at the people. Within seconds, the protagonist appears, heading toward the other soldiers. The man watching Park becomes confused, and the other soldier wonders who that man was, who then begins walking toward the other soldier. The guy asks who he is. Park, on the other hand, asks if he really said the bounty on his head was that high. The man confirming it asks who the boy was, and Park responds that he was just someone who needed a lot of money. The man's subordinates wonder who this boy could be. Shortly after, the man starts laughing at the protagonist, mentioning that it seemed he wasn't part of the central office, so it would have been better for him to mind his own business. At that moment, the protagonist starts to feel something strange, wondering what was happening to his body. The man explains that Park had looked into his eyes for more than 5 seconds, which meant he would no longer be able to move. Shortly after, the man gives an order for his soldiers to charge at Park, who then point their swords at the boy. However, the protagonist is able to move again, leaving everyone completely shocked by what had just happened. With a smile on his face, Park asks if that was magic, mentioning that it was very interesting. Then, the man uses his binding ability again, immobilizing the protagonist once more, who says that it was expected because he wasn't a small fly. He then draws his dagger, saying that the man should have thought twice before messing with him. But at that moment, Park strikes the man, who seems to have been injured by the attack. Park asks if he had any other tricks up his sleeve. He then punches the man, and a flurry of punches follows. The man is thrown back where he appears to have been defeated. Park, for his part, says that it was all very boring. The other guy thinks that to deal with that man so easily, Park must be incredibly strong, and he wonders who the protagonist really was. Meanwhile, the group of soldiers continues watching the boy. Park asks if they still wanted to fight. The group responds that they didn't. Shortly after, the protagonist points to a place, telling them to go there, asking if anyone happened to have a rope. One of the men responds that he had one. The protagonist then asks what their bounty was. However, the group responds that they didn't have a bounty because they had no choice and were forced to work with that man, or they would be killed. So delivering that man would be enough to make him rich. With tears in his eyes, the man couldn't believe that his companions had betrayed him, abandoning him after he had helped them all this time. Park, for his part, asks if he had finally woken up. The group begins insulting the man, saying that he was just a piece of trash. The boy then asks if he wouldn't get anything for getting rid of those people. Then the other man mentions that they were lying, as they were all criminals too. Surely, some of them must have bounties. However, the group responded that it wasn't true. They claimed they were really just useless vagabonds. Park, on the other hand, was called by the man, asking what the city's laws were that made him feel so unrestricted, because in that place, right there, the land was true freedom. So if he let him go, he would do whatever he could to make Park live like a king. But at that moment, the protagonist kicks the man again, telling him to be quiet. The man seemingly passed out. Park then asks if the man was saying that all those people had bounties on their heads. The man answers yes, since most of them were former criminals. Unhappy, the man thinks that it was his end. Park asks if there weren't too many to take with them, and the boy says they could leave them behind. The protagonist replies that it was time for everyone to take a nap. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a car driving down the road. Inside, the boy says they really needed his help, so they had to repay him somehow. However, the protagonist replies that they didn't need to do that. The other man then says that thanks to Park, they managed to leave that place alive. Park says that if they wanted to see it that way, they could do something for him. The group then begins to ask several questions, like what his special powers and abilities were. The man responds that his awakened ability was swordsmanship, and he learned to track by investigating through skill books. Park, surprised, realizes that one could learn magic through books. The man, also surprised, asks if Park really didn't know what his skill book was. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks it would be better to learn 1 or 2 combat magic abilities, as they could probably be useful in the future. However, something surprises him, because before him, a giant light is surrounding the area. He asks if that was a portal. The boy is surprised by the question, saying yes and mentioning that it was a level 1 dungeon, the lowest level, which is why they were planning to go there. Park says it's a pity because he might have been able to go to that place if he at least had a mercenary license. The man, shocked by what he heard, asks if Park really didn't have a license. Park replies that he really didn't have one. When a portal opens, the military first secures the area, and any monsters found in the fields are just small fry that somehow survived the attacks. And the experience one could gain in those low-level fields, where level 1 dungeons are open and ranked as E, could even allow one to surpass that level. In other words, he should actually go to level 2 dungeons. The man, still confused, wonders how this rookie, who hadn't even gone to a level 1 dungeon, managed to defeat that C-rank man. Park, noticing the man staring at him, asks what he wanted. The man apologizes, asking if he could know what Park's rank was. Kim then informs him that it was F rank, leaving the man completely stunned by what he heard. Park then asks what favor he should request. The scene cuts to the portal from earlier. From it, a person seems to be emerging. That man from before is in the area. His group seems somewhat injured after entering the portal. As a result of everything that happened during the battle, another boy had lost his hand. For that reason, they quickly needed a doctor. The man, irritated, wonders if mercenary licenses were being handed out to anyone these days. So the first thing he's going to do when he gets back to the guild is kick the person who chose those fools. However, the other boy asks him to calm down, saying he shouldn't be so hard on the rookies, since he knows the guild's condition these days. Even knowing all of this, the man is still very frustrated. He thinks that people with rich parents can easily enter that place and become awakened, and after that, their parents hire mercenaries to carry them through the dungeons. Suddenly, they're ready to join the guild and go on missions. However, it's the guild members who suffer for accepting those useless people. The guy, noticing his captain's irritation, asks if they shouldn't cool their heads. That's why they should have a drink. The man then asks how everything is going, as a level 1 dungeon was about to disappear. He asks if anything had happened, and a soldier responds that something big did, as someone had just delivered 10 looters to them. And among the captives, there was a rank C, who had certainly heard of him. The man asked if any high-ranking individual was supposed to visit them at the camps that day. However, the soldier replied no, saying it was a rank novice who didn't even have a mercenary license, and managed to capture that man. In disbelief, the man asked how that happened. The soldier answered that he didn't know the details, but according to witnesses, the rank F had simply beaten that man up. The man was then surprised, guessing it might have been the person he had seen before in the tunnel. He asked where that rank EF had gone. The soldier in turn replied that he had seen him heading toward the portals. Quickly, the man headed toward the portal again, thinking he had to witness that boy's ability with his own eyes, and if it was worth it, he might gain something valuable from that story. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and comment down for second part, and stay with us for more juicy content.